From the fog-covered alleys of Victorian London to the quiet towns and family homes that hid unspeakable crimes, Britain has witnessed killers whose names became legends of horror. For centuries, this island nation has balanced elegance and darkness, a place where innovation thrived and yet the shadows of human cruelty lingered. Among cobbled streets, silent villages, and crowded hospitals, some crimes would mark the nation forever. Tonight, we look back at 5 of the most shocking serial murders in the United Kingdom, cases that changed laws, broke communities, and redefined the meaning of evil. Top 5 serial murders that shocked Britain. Let's begin our journey through Britain's darkest chapters, 5 stories that turned fear into history. The year was 1888, the height of the British Empire. London stood as the richest city on earth, a symbol of progress and power. Steam trains thundered across the land, gas lamps lit the streets, and the skyline bristled with chimneys that never slept. To the world, Britain was the empire of innovation and order, a nation where science, industry, and civilization reigned supreme. But beneath the glittering surface, another London existed, one that the polished upper classes preferred not to see. Just a few miles from Buckingham Palace and the grand theaters of the West End, life in the East End was closer to hell than civilization. The same fog that glowed golden over Parliament rolled into the slums as a gray, suffocating shroud. Here, wealth and empire meant nothing. Hunger, disease, and despair ruled the narrow streets. At one end of the city, gentlemen dined by candlelight, sipping port and discussing empire. At the other, children scavenged for coal scraps, and women sold their bodies for a bed and a loaf of bread. It was a city divided, opulence above, misery below, and the thin fog between them hid a truth too easy to ignore. This was London at its most powerful and its most fragile. By the mid-19th century, Britain had absorbed waves of migrants. Irish families fleeing famine and poverty settled in London's East End, and from the 1880s onward, thousands of Jewish refugees arrived, escaping pogroms in the Russian Empire and Eastern Europe. They crowded into the narrow streets of Whitechapel, a parish of just 1 square mile that by 1888 held over 80,000 souls. Living conditions were brutal. 55% of children born here died before reaching the age of 5. Crime, drunkenness, and violence were routine. For many women, survival meant walking the streets at night. By official estimate, there were 62 brothels and more than 1,200 prostitutes in Whitechapel alone. Each evening, more than 8,000 people sought a bed in the area's 233 lodging houses, a coffin-sized space for 4 pennies a night, or a spot to sleep upright, hanging over a rope, for 2. This was the backdrop, a city within a city, forgotten by progress, despised by the press, feared by the rich. The East End was portrayed as a breeding ground of moral decay, crime, and disease. And it was here, amid the noise of carriages and the glow of gas lamps, that a shadow began to move, silent, patient, and soon to become the most feared figure in British history. The first murder came before dawn on August 31st, 1888. A carman found the body of Mary Ann Nichols, her throat cut twice, her abdomen ripped open. At first, it seemed another act of drunken brutality. But a week later, another woman, Annie Chapman, was found in a backyard on Hanbury Street, her throat severed, her intestines laid beside her, her uterus missing. Then, on September 30th, came the night that changed everything, the double event. In Berner Street, Elizabeth Stride was discovered with her throat cut, her body otherwise untouched, as if the killer had been interrupted. Less than an hour later, in Mitre Square, Catherine Eddowes was found. Her face had been carved beyond recognition, her organs removed. On a wall nearby, police found a chalk message: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Fearing riots against Jewish immigrants, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner ordered it erased before dawn. The terror reached its peak on November 9th. Mary Jane Kelly, only 25, was found in her single-room flat at Miller's Court. Her body was mutilated almost beyond human form, every surface of the room spattered with blood. Seasoned detectives who entered later said it was the worst crime scene they had ever witnessed. These 5 women, Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, and Kelly, became known as the Canonical Five, believed to be the true victims of the killer history would call Jack the Ripper. The investigation that followed was unlike anything London had ever seen. 2 police forces, the Metropolitan Police and the City of London Police, both claimed jurisdiction, their territories separated by nothing more than invisible boundaries drawn through the fog. What should have been cooperation soon became competition. Officers stumbled over one another in the labyrinth of Whitechapel, each desperate to be the first to end the nightmare. Hundreds of men were deployed across the East End, questioning anyone who lingered after dark. More than 2,000 interviews were conducted, and the streets pulsed with suspicion. Posters promised rewards, but the promises brought little more than chaos. False confessions poured in by the dozens. Frightened citizens pointed fingers at strangers, and the press, hungry for blood and sensation, followed every rumor like hounds on a scent. Then came the letters. On September 27th, the Central News Agency received one written in red ink. Its words were taunting, calm, almost amused. "Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I love my work." It was signed, Jack the Ripper. Within weeks, another parcel arrived, a letter accompanied by half of what was claimed to be a human kidney, allegedly taken from one of the victims. Whether written by the killer himself or by journalists chasing infamy, these messages did what the murderer never could. They gave him a name and made him immortal. Inside Scotland Yard, the pressure grew unbearable. Lists of suspects filled entire ledgers. A Polish immigrant named Aaron Kosminski, later confined to an asylum, was one. Montague John Druitt, a well-educated barrister found drowned in the Thames shortly after the final murder, was another. Others followed. Michael Ostrog, a thief and conman. Thomas Cutbush, a disturbed medical student. Each seemed promising, for a day, for a week, until evidence dissolved and another theory took its place. Outside, the fog thickened, and so did the madness. Every butcher's knife became a potential weapon, every shadow a suspect. In the pubs of Whitechapel, people whispered that the killer might be a surgeon, a foreigner, even a member of the royal household. Theories spread faster than truth, and for every rumor silenced, 2 more were born. At the center of it all stood Inspector Frederick Aberline, one of Scotland Yard's finest detectives. He walked those streets night after night, armed only with instinct and exhaustion. But instinct was not enough. In 1888, there were no fingerprints, no DNA, no photography to capture the scene, only lantern light and chaos. Crowds trampled evidence before it could be collected. Rain washed away blood before it could be studied. Every clue was swallowed by the noise, the confusion, and the fog that never lifted. And in that fog, the Ripper remained untouchable, a ghost the law could never catch, because the city itself seemed to protect him. By December, the killings stopped as suddenly as they had begun. London breathed again, but uneasily. The Ripper had disappeared, leaving 5 dead and a city forever changed. The aftermath reached far beyond Whitechapel. The murder sparked outrage at the government's neglect of the poor. Charities, reformers, and journalists began calling for better housing and social aid in the East End. The case also transformed law enforcement. Communication between police divisions improved, detective methods became more structured, and the idea of serial murder began to take shape. But the Ripper's influence extended beyond policing. His shadow crawled into literature, film, and the collective imagination of the Western world. For more than 100 years, writers, criminologists, and armchair detectives have tried to unmask him. Theories have come and gone, each claiming to have solved the mystery, none succeeding. Jack the Ripper became the archetype of the unknown killer, the faceless predator lurking in the dark. His crimes revealed how fascination can blur with fear, how the line between investigation and obsession can vanish. And in the alleys of modern London, where the cobblestones still glisten after rain, his story endures, not as proof of who he was, but as a reflection of what humanity is capable of when cruelty meets neglect. He came out of nowhere. He killed with precision. He disappeared into the fog. And more than 100 years later, Britain hasn't escaped his shadow. For over 2 decades, one man moved quietly through the northern town of Hyde, England, a trusted doctor with a kind smile and a reassuring voice. He visited his patients' homes, drank tea with them, listened to their aches and stories, and prescribed their medicine. To the people of Hyde, he was not just their physician, he was family. His name was Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman. Born in Nottingham in 1946, Shipman grew up in an ordinary working-class home. As a boy, he was intelligent and serious, but solitary, distant, and withdrawn. When he was 17, his mother, whom he adored, died of lung cancer. He watched her fade away day by day, comforted only by the morphine that eased her pain. That moment, the power of a doctor to control suffering and death, would stay with him for the rest of his life. Years later, after medical school at Leeds, Shipman began practicing as a general practitioner. He was known as professional, punctual, and quietly intense. But there were rumors, even then, whispers about the doctor's fascination with death, his secret struggles with addiction to pethidine, a medical-grade narcotic. In 1976, he was caught forging prescriptions and forced to leave his practice. He avoided prison, entered rehabilitation, and after a short period of disciplinary oversight, returned to medicine. By the early 1980s, Harold Shipman had rebuilt his image. He moved to Hyde, near Manchester, opened a clinic, and became the kind of doctor people trusted with their lives. He was thorough, patient, and always made house calls, the doctor who would arrive in his small gray car carrying his leather bag and a calm demeanor. For the elderly, he was a blessing, dependable, polite, always available. For many, he was the last face they saw before they died. Shipman's murders began quietly. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, just a simple injection of morphine or diamorphine administered with the care of a professional. Then came the signature. He would sign the death certificate himself, mark the cause as old age or cardiac failure, and sometimes even comfort the family afterward. The funerals were swift, the cremations arranged smoothly, and nobody questioned the trusted doctor's word. Between 1975 and 1998, Harold Shipman killed hundreds of his patients, mostly elderly women who lived alone, many of them in good health. Some died sitting in their favorite chairs. Others were found in bed, peaceful, as if they had simply drifted away. Families would thank Shipman for being there at the end, never realizing that he had caused it. It wasn't until the death of one of his longtime patients, Kathleen Grundy, that the pattern began to crack. Grundy was 77 years old, a respected former mayor of Hyde, still active and healthy. When she was found dead in June 1998, Shipman recorded the cause as old age. But weeks later, Grundy's daughter, a solicitor, discovered a new will. It left almost all of her mother's estate, over £300,000, to Harold Shipman. The document was crude, obviously forged. The daughter went to the police. Grundy's body was exhumed. Tests revealed lethal levels of diamorphine, medical-grade heroin, in her tissues. Investigators began quietly examining other cases linked to the same doctor, and what they found was staggering. Medical records showed patterns. Shipman had been the last person to see his patients alive. Many of their deaths occurred shortly after his visits. When police searched his computer, they found something chilling. He had been altering patient files after their deaths, editing medical histories to justify terminal conditions that never existed. In September 1998, Harold Shipman was arrested. The scale of what followed shocked Britain to its core. Police reviewed hundreds of death certificates, cross-referencing them with his appointments. Out of more than 15,000 patients he had treated, at least 200 were believed to have died by his hand. Some estimates placed the true number closer to 250. At his trial in 2000, Shipman sat calmly as prosecutors presented the evidence. Morphine overdoses, falsified records, signatures, and the forged will that had finally exposed him. He denied everything. The defense claimed he was simply a caring doctor accused of coincidences. But the coincidences formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. After a 6-month trial, Harold Shipman was convicted of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge declared that Shipman must spend the rest of his life in prison with no chance of freedom. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, Shipman never confessed, never explained why he did it. Psychologists would later argue that his killings were not acts of mercy, but of control. Each injection was a performance of power, deciding who lived, who died, and when. Some believed he saw himself as a god. Others thought he was still that 17-year-old boy replaying the scene of his mother's death over and over, trapped in a twisted imitation of care. 4 years into his sentence, on January 13, 2004, Harold Shipman hanged himself in his cell at Wakefield Prison. He was 57 years old. Even his death raised questions. Was it guilt, fear, or simply the last act of control from a man who always wanted the last word? The aftermath of his crimes was seismic. The Shipman inquiry, led by High Court Judge Dame Smith, uncovered systemic failures that had allowed him to operate unchecked for decades. General practitioners were rarely supervised. Death certificates could be signed without review. Cremations required no independent confirmation. Shipman had exploited a system built on trust, and in doing so, destroyed that trust forever. New laws were introduced. Medical oversight became stricter. Procedures for verifying death were completely rewritten. It was one of the most significant reforms in British healthcare history, all because one doctor had shown how fragile faith in authority could be. For the people of Hyde, the betrayal cut deepest. They had trusted him, invited him into their homes, let him care for their parents, their grandparents, and he had turned that trust into murder. Even years later, many could not bring themselves to believe it. To them, Dr. Shipman had always been kind. That was the horror of it. Harold Shipman's name would never fade. He became something larger than a man, a warning, a reminder that evil does not always arrive in the night with a knife. It sometimes comes in daylight, wearing a stethoscope, offering comfort. And as the fog of Whitechapel once hid a killer in shadow, the white walls of a small-town clinic had hidden another, quiet, meticulous, and far more ordinary. In the quiet English city of Gloucester, behind the brick facade of an ordinary terraced house, the most disturbing crimes in modern British history were carried out, not by a shadowy stranger, but by a husband and wife who called it home. Their names were Frederick and Rosemary West, a couple whose story began like any other and ended in horror. Fred West was born in 1941 in rural Herefordshire, one of 6 children in a poor farming family. His upbringing was marked by violence and rumors of incest. From an early age, Fred learned that control could replace affection, and punishment could masquerade as love. He left school at 15, barely literate but quick with his hands. Beneath his calm charm, there was cruelty. He was known to spy on women, and by his early 20s had already faced charges for sexual assault. Rosemary Letts was born 12 years later, in 1953, to a turbulent home of her own, an abusive father, and a mother treated for mental illness with electroshock therapy while pregnant. As a child, Rose was volatile and unpredictable. By her teens, she was sexually active, aggressive, and often violent. When Rose met Fred in 1969, she was 15, he was 27, already married with 2 children. Within months, she moved in with him. The connection was instant and dangerous, 2 damaged people drawn together by something darker than love. Fred saw in Rose someone he could shape. Rose saw in Fred someone who would never flinch at her impulses. By the early 1970s, they were married, living at 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester, the address that would later become infamous as the House of Horrors. To the neighbors, they were eccentric but friendly. Fred worked as a builder and handyman. Rose ran a small child-minding service. They appeared ordinary, almost dull. But inside the house, behind the closed curtains, the couple built a private world of sexual violence, domination, and murder. Fred and Rose began targeting young women, runaways, hitchhikers, and lodgers. Many of them were seeking rooms or work. The Wests offered both, then trapped their victims inside the soundproof basement Fred had built. There the women were bound, raped, and tortured, often for days. When the couple grew bored, Fred would kill them, usually by strangulation, before dismembering their bodies and burying them under the floor, in the garden, or in the cellar. It is believed that Fred's first murder was Anna McFall, a former nanny and lover, killed in 1967 while pregnant with his child. Rose's first confirmed killing came after she joined him. Together they killed Charmaine, Fred's daughter from his first marriage, in 1971. The little girl was 8 years old. Their violence escalated. Between 1973 and 1979, the Wests killed at least 9 women. Some were strangers, others were girls who had lived with them. Their victims included Linda Gow, Carol Ann Cooper, Lucy Partington, and Therese Siegenthaler, names that for decades remained missing person reports until the truth surfaced. Fred recorded many of his crimes in a grim collection of photographs and tapes. He treated murder like a pastime, something private, controlled, and almost routine. To outsiders, the family seemed strange but functional. Their children went to school. Visitors dropped by. No one imagined what lay beneath the floorboards. Rose, meanwhile, became as violent as Fred, sometimes more. She was a full partner in the killings and the abuse of their own children. Neighbors occasionally reported screams, but the Wests always had explanations: a fight, a tantrum, a noisy tenant. And in an era before mandatory welfare checks and child protection laws, those explanations were enough. The murders might have continued indefinitely if not for one of their own children. In 1992, one of the West daughters confided in a friend that she and her siblings had been sexually abused by their parents. Police were contacted. What began as a routine inquiry into child abuse soon unraveled into something far worse. When officers entered 25 Cromwell Street, they noticed how the house felt wrong. Heavy air, newly plastered walls, patches of concrete that didn't match. Acting on suspicion, they began to excavate the garden. On February 24, 1994, police uncovered human bones buried beneath the patio. Within weeks, they found more: torsos, skulls, and partial remains of multiple women. Each discovery led to another. Fred West was arrested. As detectives questioned him, his calm demeanor barely shifted. "There are more," he eventually admitted, "and I'll show you where." Excavations revealed 9 bodies at the property, including those of the missing lodgers and the West's own daughter, Heather, the child they had told neighbors had gone away to boarding school. Further searches in nearby fields uncovered 3 more victims, bringing the total confirmed deaths to 12. Rose was arrested soon after. Unlike Fred, she denied everything. Cold, emotionless, her only concern being that the neighbors might think less of her. But Fred's confessions left no doubt. He described the killings in chilling detail, claiming full responsibility and insisting that Rose had known nothing. Detectives didn't believe him. They saw the couple as partners in every sense, united in cruelty. As the investigation continued, media attention exploded. Crowds gathered outside the house. Reporters from around the world descended on Gloucester, and the street was cordoned off behind police barriers. The words "House of Horrors" appeared on every front page. Before the trial could begin, Fred West killed himself in his cell on January 1, 1995, hanging himself with a bedsheet. He left behind him a note for Rose: "I'll always love you." Rose stood trial later that year for 10 counts of murder. The evidence was overwhelming: bone fragments, forensic matches, the testimony of surviving children, and Fred's own admissions. Throughout the proceedings, she showed no remorse, no emotion. The jury found her guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning she would never be released. After the convictions, the house at 25 Cromwell Street was demolished in 1996. The rubble was removed in secret, and the ground was left empty, a blank space in the middle of the row where the Wests once lived, as if the city itself wanted to erase what had happened there. The impact of the case was profound. It exposed serious flaws in social care, child protection, and police procedures for tracking missing persons. More than that, it forced Britain to confront an uncomfortable truth. that the face of evil can wear the mask of normality. Fred and Rose West were not monsters from nightmares. They were parents, neighbors, and employers who smiled to your face while burying others beneath their feet. To this day, questions remain. How many victims were there really? Fred hinted at more before his death, speaking of others buried elsewhere. Police believe there may be several undiscovered graves. The name West has since become synonymous with cruelty hidden in plain sight, a reminder that horror does not always lurk in dark alleys or desolate fields. Sometimes it lives next door, behind the curtains of a quiet suburban house. By the mid-1970s, Britain was changing. The country that once ruled an empire now struggled through economic decline. Factories closed, unemployment soared, and industrial towns across northern England fell into poverty. Among the crumbling mills and darkened streets of Yorkshire, a new kind of fear began to spread, one that would consume the nation for the next 5 years. The first body appeared in 1975 in Leeds. A woman named Wilma McCann, a mother of 4, was found near her home, beaten and stabbed. The brutality shocked the community, but in those early days, no one imagined it was the beginning of a pattern, one that would lead to the largest manhunt in British history. The killer was Peter William Sutcliffe, a lorry driver from Bingley, West Yorkshire. On the surface, he was unremarkable, quiet, polite, with dark hair, thick sideburns, and a calm, almost shy demeanor. To his co-workers, he was reliable. To his wife Sonia, he was devoted. But behind the calm exterior was a man gripped by rage and delusion. Born in 1946 to a working-class Catholic family, Sutcliffe grew up small and insecure, mocked by other boys for being timid. He developed a fascination with prostitutes at an early age, not out of lust, but resentment. As he entered adulthood, his anger turned inward, then outward. He began visiting red light districts, claiming later that he believed God had chosen him to kill women he considered unclean. It was a delusion that would define his life. Between 1975 and 1980, Peter Sutcliffe murdered 13 women and attacked at least 7 others. His victims came from different backgrounds, some sex workers, others students, shop assistants, or civil servants, but all were women caught alone in the wrong place at the wrong time. He used a hammer, knives, and screwdrivers, striking his victims in the dark before mutilating their bodies. The precision of his attacks and the randomness of his targets spread panic across the north of England. At first, the press treated the killings as isolated incidents, confined to the dangerous corners of cities like Leeds, Bradford, and Manchester. But when the murders continued, newspapers gave the killer a name that would haunt Britain for decades: the Yorkshire Ripper. The echo of Jack the Ripper from a century earlier was not accidental. The crimes felt eerily similar, sudden, savage, and unsolved. As the death toll rose, women lived in fear. They changed their routines, traveled in groups, avoided going out after dark. Police urged caution, but seemed unable to stop the killings. The public's frustration turned to outrage as months passed without progress. At the height of the panic, the authorities committed over 1 million man-hours to the case. More than 250,000 people were interviewed, and the investigation filled an entire building with documents. It was, by any measure, one of the most extensive manhunts in British history. But the investigation was deeply flawed. Detectives were overwhelmed by information and distracted by their own assumptions. They believed the killer's victims were exclusively sex workers, dismissing connections when victims didn't fit that profile. This bias would allow Sutcliffe to keep killing even as police spoke to him multiple times during their inquiry. Then, in 1979, the investigation took a disastrous turn. West Yorkshire police received a letter and audio tape from someone claiming to be the Ripper. The man spoke with a strong Wearside or Sunderland accent and taunted detectives, saying, "I'm Jack. I see you're still having no luck catching me." The letter was signed Jack the Ripper. The voice became famous overnight. Detectives shifted their entire investigation to find the man with that accent, discarding leads that didn't match. They were convinced the tape was genuine, but it was a hoax, later traced to a man named John Humble, who falsely believed he was helping the police. The deception wasted nearly 2 years of work and allowed Sutcliffe to continue killing freely. All the while, Peter Sutcliffe blended in. He worked as a truck driver, traveling across the country, often spending nights parked in industrial estates or red light areas, convenient hunting grounds. He returned home to his wife, who never suspected anything. To her, he was a quiet man who sometimes stayed out late for work. The turning point came in January 1981. Sutcliffe was stopped by 2 uniformed officers in Sheffield while parked in a car with false number plates. His companion, a woman, was a known sex worker. The officers brought him in for questioning. At the station, while waiting to be processed, one of them decided to check the car again and found a hammer and knife hidden behind the seat. When confronted, Sutcliffe broke down and confessed. "It's me," he said. "I am the Ripper." Over the next days, he calmly recounted the murders, describing each attack in detail, even recalling the victims' clothing and the order in which he had struck them. His tone was emotionless, as if discussing another person entirely. He told detectives he had heard voices from God commanding him to kill. When the case went to trial in 1981, the court was divided. The defense argued Sutcliffe was mentally ill, suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. The prosecution insisted he was fully aware of his actions. The jury agreed with the prosecution. Sutcliffe was found guilty of 13 counts of murder and 7 of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent life sentences, later converted to a whole life order, meaning he would never be released. For decades, Sutcliffe remained imprisoned, first in Parkhurst Prison, later at Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital. In interviews, he often downplayed his crimes, showing little remorse. "It just happened," he once said. "It was out of my hands." He died in November 2020, age 74, after contracting COVID-19 in custody. The legacy of the Yorkshire Ripper case was immense. It exposed fatal flaws in British policing, the lack of communication between regional forces, the over-reliance on flawed evidence, and the gender bias that had dismissed victims because of their occupation. It also changed the way Britain understood violence against women. The case sparked marches and protests, with women across the country demanding safety, accountability, and equality in the eyes of law enforcement. But above all, it left scars that never healed. For years, the families of the victims lived under the shadow of media headlines that glorified the killer and reduced their loved ones to footnotes. Only decades later did the public conversation begin to shift from the myth of the Ripper to the memory of the women whose lives he stole. Peter Sutcliffe, like Jack the Ripper before him, had become a symbol, not just of evil, but of failure. The failure of a system that had seen the warning signs, spoken to the killer, and still let him go. And when his final confession was complete and his cell door closed for the last time, Britain was left with a single question echoing through its history. How many more women might have lived if someone had simply listened? March 13, 1996. A small town in central Scotland awoke to what seemed an ordinary Wednesday morning. Dunblane, population fewer than 10,000, was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where children walked to school together through the drizzle, and where nothing truly bad ever seemed to happen. At 9:35 a.m., the bell rang at Dunblane Primary School, signaling the start of a normal day. In the gymnasium, a class of 28 young children, 5 and 6 years old, were warming up for their physical education lesson. Their teacher, Gwen Mayer, was supervising them. Moments later, the sound of laughter was shattered by the echo of gunfire. The man who stepped into that gym was Thomas Hamilton, 43 years old, a former scoutmaster and shop owner from Stirling. He carried 4 legally owned handguns, 2 Browning high-power pistols, and 2 Smith & Wesson revolvers, and more than 700 rounds of ammunition. He entered through a side door, raised a pistol, and began firing. In less than 5 minutes, Hamilton shot dead 16 children and 1 teacher, injuring 15 others before turning the gun on himself. When police arrived, they found the gymnasium covered in silence. Small bodies lay beside skipping ropes and softballs, backpacks still open from the morning's lessons. It was the worst school shooting in British history. Hamilton's motives died with him. Investigators later pieced together a portrait of a man deeply isolated and increasingly paranoid. Once a respected scout leader, he had been banned from the Scouts in the early 1980s following complaints of inappropriate behavior toward boys. Since then, he had nursed a growing resentment toward local authorities, writing angry letters, filing complaints, and fantasizing about revenge. In the months before the attack, he had withdrawn completely from society. In his house, police found a collection of weapons, ammunition, and correspondence, showing his obsession with being persecuted by the local council. He believed he was the victim of a conspiracy, but no note explained why he chose the primary school or why he directed his fury at children. The tragedy stunned Britain. The nation was unprepared for an act of violence so random, so senseless, and so intimate. Dunblane was a town where nearly everyone knew the victims or their families. Within hours, the school was surrounded by parents in tears, waiting for news that never came. Many of the emergency workers who entered the gym that day would later speak of nightmares that lasted for years. As the shock spread, so did grief. Churches opened their doors through the night. In cities across the country, people left flowers outside schools, even those hundreds of miles away. The Queen sent condolences. The Prime Minister, John Major, called the attack an act of madness beyond understanding. The country mourned together and demanded change. The investigation into how Thomas Hamilton had obtained his weapons quickly uncovered disturbing truths. He had legally purchased his handguns under the Firearms Act, despite being known to police for erratic behavior and despite multiple complaints over the years. Some officers had flagged his instability, but the system allowed him to keep his firearms license. The failure was systemic, a loophole of bureaucracy and complacency that had given a killer easy access to deadly weapons. In the weeks that followed, the British government ordered a public inquiry led by Lord Cullen, a senior Scottish judge. The Cullen Inquiry, as it became known, lasted months, gathering testimony from survivors, teachers, police, and experts. Its findings were unequivocal. The existing gun laws were dangerously lax. Cullen recommended sweeping reform, tighter restrictions on firearm ownership, stricter licensing, and a ban on private ownership of most handguns. Public support for change was overwhelming. Parents of the victims formed a campaign called Snowdrop, named after the first flower to bloom after winter, a symbol of hope and remembrance. Their movement gathered nearly 1 million signatures, the largest petition in British history at the time. The message was clear: never again. By the following year, Parliament passed the Firearms Amendment Act, 1997, effectively banning private ownership of handguns in the United Kingdom. It was one of the swiftest and most comprehensive legislative responses to a mass shooting anywhere in the world. The Dunblane Massacre became a turning point, not only for gun control, but for Britain's collective conscience. It forced the nation to confront the fragility of safety, the vulnerability of its children, and the illusion that it could never happen here. For the families, however, there was no closure, only the quiet weight of absence. Every March, the town of Dunblane falls silent. Candles are lit in windows, flowers left outside the school, and the names of the victims, 16 children and their teacher, are read aloud in remembrance. Among them, Charlotte Dunn, Megan Turner, Joanna Ross, and Gwen Mayer, who shielded her class until her final breath. The school was rebuilt. The gym where the massacre took place was demolished, replaced by a garden of peace. The people of Dunblane chose not to live defined by tragedy, but by compassion. Survivors grew up to become teachers, doctors, parents, carrying the memory of their classmates quietly with them. Years later, one of those survivors, Andy Murray, who would go on to become a world tennis champion, spoke about that day for the first time. He had been 8 years old, hiding under a desk as the shots rang out. "It's something you never forget," he said. "It stays with you." The name Thomas Hamilton is now rarely spoken in Dunblane. The community has ensured that the focus remains on those who were lost, not the man who took them. The Snowdrop campaign's success stands as a testament to their memory, a reminder that grief can lead to change and that even the darkest morning can bring light. Unlike many countries haunted by mass shootings, Britain acted once and decisively. Since Dunblane, the United Kingdom has not suffered another school shooting. For that reason, the legacy of the tragedy is not only sorrow, but prevention. The lives saved because a small Scottish town demanded that no one else should endure what they did. Dunblane changed the law, and in doing so, it changed Britain. But it also left behind a question that echoes through every generation. What turns an ordinary man into a monster, and how do we stop the next one before it begins? And so, from the fog of Whitechapel to the quiet halls of a Scottish primary school, the history of Britain's darkest crimes draws a single unbroken line: the cost of complacency, the danger of trust misplaced, and the truth that evil is never confined to one time or one place. From the gas-lit alleys of Victorian London to the suburban streets of modern Britain, these 5 stories trace a century of darkness, 5 killers who in their own ways changed the nation. Jack the Ripper emerged from poverty and fog, his identity never revealed, his victims forgotten by the world until their deaths forced it to look into the shadows. He was the beginning, the moment Britain first learned that horror could hide in plain sight. Nearly 100 years later, Harold Shipman wore a white coat instead of a cloak. He didn't strike in the night, but in daylight, in the homes of those who trusted him most. His crimes shattered faith in the very system meant to protect life. Then came Fred and Rose West, whose crimes proved that evil could live within the walls of an ordinary house, smiling across the garden fence while burying its victims beneath the floor. Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, brought fear back to the streets, reminding the world that brutality doesn't die with time, it adapts. His capture revealed not only one man's madness, but a system that had failed to listen, to believe, to act. And finally, Dunblane, a morning of innocence lost, when the violence Britain thought it had buried came crashing into a school gym, and a country's grief became the catalyst for change. Across these stories, one pattern endures. Each time horror emerged, Britain answered, sometimes too late, but always with reflection, reform, and remembrance. New laws were written, new systems were built, but beneath every statute and every headline lay the same unspoken question: can evil ever truly be prevented? These cases are not just chapters in history, they are mirrors. They show the dangers of ignorance, the cost of complacency, and the fragility of trust. They remind us that monsters do not always come from dark corners. Sometimes they are neighbors, doctors, fathers, or the strangers we never notice passing by. Time has washed away the blood, the fear, the headlines, but the names remain, the victims, not the killers. They are the reason we remember. Because history does not only belong to the ones who took life, it belongs to those whose lives were taken. And as Britain moves forward, from the fog of Whitechapel to the quiet town of Dunblane, one truth remains constant. Evil evolves, but so does our will to confront it. Dark crimes real, in memory of the victims.